Hello and welcome to World History Encyclopedia. My name is Kelly, and today I am joined with author and journalist Katherine Pangonis. Katherine is a historian specialising in the medieval world of the Mediterranean and the Middle East, and she is primarily interested in bringing forgotten narratives, particularly those of women, into the public eye. And that is exactly what she has done with her new book, Queens of Jerusalem, The Women Who Dared to Rule. Enough from me, let's chat to Katherine about her new book and those Jerusalem queens. Thank you so much for joining me today and coming on the channel to talk about your new book, Queens of Jerusalem. It's great to have you on. Do you want to?
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. Do you want to start off by telling us what your book is all about?
Yes. Okay. So my book is about a dynasty of women who ruled in the Middle East during the medieval period, specifically in the 12th century during the times of the Crusades. And I start with Morphia of Melitene. She's an Armenian princess who marries Baldwin II to become the first crowned Queen of Jerusalem. And so I look at her life and the role she played politically during her husband's life, and then also the lives of her four daughters, and then her granddaughters, the daughters of those daughters. And the reason I chose to look at these women is because they, despite living in a quite a strongly patriarchal and medieval environment, these women were able to seize real power due to the instability in the region. And the fact that Morphia had four daughters was a major factor as well. There were no sons to inherit, which meant that women were able to succeed to political positions and actually wield power. And I thought that was really interesting. So my book was looking at how they did that, what they achieved, and what the major events of their lives were.
So fascinating. I feel like when I did Crusader history, I didn't learn anything really about the women that were, there and in power during that time. Is there a gap in the scholarship? Is there a reason why we don't?
So for me, that was what brought me to write this book. I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to say actually nowadays there's a gap in the scholarship, because in the last 50 years, there has been a lot more attention paid to the roles played by women. And there are a lot more female historians, actually, Natasha Hodgson and Helen Nicholson, who have been unearthing the stories of these women and really shining a light on it. But this has mainly been in an academic context, sort of in journals and peer-reviewed articles and this sort of thing, which is great. And it's great for me as a writer and a researcher. But there really has been nothing in the public sphere, and certainly nothing for sort of students studying the Crusades and just the general reader. And so what I wanted to do was to bring a lot of this research together with some of my own original research and make something accessible for general readership. Because exactly like you, I did the Crusades. I actually did it when I was at school, and that's sort of where the seed of this book got planted, because we did the Crusades and it was obviously really interesting. But the things that I wanted to find out more about was Queen Melisende of Jerusalem and Princess Alice of Antioch. These are two daughters of Morphia, who I look at in my book. And we heard their names in the A-level history course, but we really didn't study them, And when I asked my teacher, oh, are there any books you can recommend to read more about these women? The answer was sort of not really. So when I was 18, I wasn't exactly going to go off and write a book. But then when I finished my master's, I thought, here's my way into this, and this is something that needs doing, because 6 years later it still hadn't been done. So
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, reading it as I'm not a scholar in medieval history, but reading it as just the general public, it is really accessible and it is really easy to read. And as someone who isn't super familiar with that time period and with the names, it is definitely an easy read in that respect. Like, you think it might be heavy, but it really isn't. And it kind of it read, at times I was reading it and I forgot that I was reading nonfiction.
I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up. The things that happened to them, the things they were doing. It's so exciting. It's a roller coaster at times.
It was like gossip and scandal. I'm like, geez, this is so entertaining. It was a wonderful read.
Oh, thank you. I'm really glad you enjoyed it.
So you've mentioned a couple of the women in the book. Do you want to maybe just go over all the other women, the main women that you mentioned?
Oh yeah, so I look, I think it's 7 women. I'm going to trip myself up, but I'm pretty sure it's 7, and I'm going to rattle you through them. So we start with Morphia. She's an Armenian princess. She's born in the region of Melitene. She marries Baldwin II, an arranged marriage, of course. She brings a lot of money with her, and an alliance with her father, because when Baldwin marries her, he's ruling the county of Edessa. That's the northernmost Crusader state, and it borders on Armenian territory, so it makes sense for the ruler of Edessa to marry an Armenian woman. That's how they get together. Then Baldwin, his cousin, dies. He gets promoted to be king of Jerusalem. Morphia comes with him, and he actually delays his coronation so that he and Morphia can be crowned together in sort of equal partnership. I mean, she's a queen consort, not a queen regnant, but it's symbolically very important that he waited for his wife, because this is the foundation of this dynasty of really formidable rulers. So we start with Morphia. Morphia has 4 daughters with Baldwin, and I go through each of their lives. So I'll actually start with the youngest, Yvette, because she has, I think, probably the least written about her. But Yvette has a very traumatic childhood because she's actually traded as a hostage. This is what I mean by political instability. It's war, it's kidnapping, it's prisoners of war, it's all of this sort of thing. And at some point in Yvette's childhood, her father is captured and he's in jail. And the only way to negotiate his release is to exchange her with him, so they still have a valuable hostage. So that's part of Yvette's story that happens to her when she's very young. And then as a result of that, she actually can't go on to have a big political career and marry and things because she's considered tainted by this experience of being held hostage by the Muslims. So then she actually becomes a nun, but a very powerful one. She rules this very important convent that her older sister, builds specially for her so she can have this sort of good life, an important life. And then the next daughter is Hodierna. She becomes the Countess of Tripoli, and she's implicated in a couple of assassinations. So she also has a colourful career and also rules this very important territory as regent for her son following the death of her husband. So she also has quite a lot of power in her lifetime. And the second elder sister is Alice. She's a real firecracker. She becomes the Princess of Antioch when she's 17 years old, something like that, maybe 18, very, late teens, by marrying the Prince of Antioch. And she, when her husband dies, decides she really wants to rule in her own right and be Princess of Antioch. And so in order to do this, she will launch not 1, but 3 rebellions against the crown of Jerusalem to try and keep Antioch for herself and rule it independently. And she, I won't tell you what happens, but it's a bumpy ride for Alice. And then her oldest sister is really the central character of my book, is Queen Melisende of Jerusalem, because she is the heir of Baldwin and Morphia, as the eldest daughter. And she's really interesting because she's sort of groomed for inheritance from a young age. We see her witnessing charters, so standing witness to laws being passed. We see her being acknowledged in official documents as the daughter of the King of Jerusalem, the heiress to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And so she's very important. And then she goes on to have this insane and very long political career where she does end up ruling Jerusalem in her own right, during one of the most difficult points in Jerusalem's, in the history of Jerusalem in the 12th century, in the Crusader States, and has a lot of power and garners a lot of respect from those about her. So, we have a letter from Bernard, Abbot of Clairvaux, writing to Melisende when her husband dies. And you'd think that a churchman at this time would be like, you should get married again, get another guy involved here. But he doesn't. He says you should put your hand to strong things and be a man in a woman. And, it's a kind of, today you'd find this letter quite condescending and sexist, because it is, because he says in order to rule, you must basically be a man and act like a man. And so people aren't asking, where's the man? But for the time, it's incredibly progressive, because he doesn't counsel her to marry again. He just counsels her to step up to the mark and rule. And that's really rare for a churchman to advise a female ruler to do this. So, and then when she dies, the chroniclers, William of Tyre, among others, they say really very deeply respectful things about her. They call her a woman of unusual wisdom who is equal to the kings and to the other princes. So she does really well. But her, again, no spoilers, but it's a bumpy ride, her reign. And all good things must come to an end. And then after her, I look at, who comes next? Well, then I look at the life of Eleanor of Aquitaine, who I know you are a bit of a fan of. We'll talk more about her, and probably needs less of an introduction because she's so well known. And then because Eleanor goes on crusade and she meets Melisende, and she's received at the court of Antioch, she's received at the court of Jerusalem, and has a very interesting career in the East. And then following that, I talk about Constance of Antioch, Alice, the firecracker from earlier, her daughter, and also Agnes of Courtenay, who is sort of an uncrowned queen of Jerusalem. She sort of is a kingmaker, pulls all the strings, but is never crowned, and actually has a very difficult life, and is always presented as evil in the chronicles, but is quite a complicated character. And then I talk about the life of Agnes's daughter Sibylla, who is the final crowned Queen of Jerusalem to rule in Jerusalem, because it's during Sibylla's reign that the city falls to Saladin, and then Sibylla unfortunately dies in a siege camp in front of the walls of Acre, trying to retake the city of Acre. But yeah, so those are the women I look at. And yeah, as you said earlier, you can't really make this stuff up. It does feel like writing fiction a lot of the time, with the ins and outs and the political intrigues and the battles, but it's all true. It's actually a very well documented period of history. We've got, so many chronicles about this period. Everyone, because it was such a captivating and exciting time for medieval writers that everyone was just scribbling away, it seems, from like knights in the army to clerics and everybody else. But no, that's an overview of the women in the book, and yeah.
Brilliant. And obviously they've all lived remarkable lives, all doing different things, some, just brilliant to read. And you mentioned William of Tyre. I know as I was reading, I noticed he was probably the main source you got information from. Did you use other sources? How did you work with their sort of views on women and then sort of getting their real stories?
Yeah, that's a great question. So William of Tyre, I have him here actually. Very important, very big part of my life for a very long time. William of Tyre. So he is the main source of this period, because he's actually just a very he's ahead of his time as a historian. Actually, I think he's got claim to be one of the best medieval chroniclers of his age, because he sort of intersperses sort of proper research, first person interviews. He talks about he needs to find something out, so he goes and meets the elderly nun in the convent, and he goes and sits with her and has a chat with her and gets her story and her perspective, and he uses that in his history. And so he's using his own first-hand witness, first-hand eyewitness account of events, experience of events even. He's using interviews with older people who've witnessed more, and he's using other texts. He's clearly got access to some of the earlier sources. And he's a thorough historian. So, I'm writing a new book now actually about Mediterranean cities, and I often look to William of Tyre, because every time William comes to a new city, whether it's Jerusalem or Antioch or Tyre, he gives a really quite a thorough description of its history, or at least what medieval people considered its history to be. So he gives you a lot of background on places, which is interesting. So no, that's why he's the main source, because he's writing in the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem. He's born there. He's educated in Europe, but he's born and bred in the Crusader States, and then holds some very important positions from he's, I think, deacon of Tyre, then he becomes Archbishop of Tyre, but he's also the Chancellor of the kingdom and the tutor to one of the kings. So he's the tutor to Melisende's grandson and the court historian of Melisende's son. So he's got a lot of experience. But for all that he's a brilliant historian, he's not, immune from the sort of misogyny of his day. And misogyny is a funny word to apply to William of Tyre, because misogyny was a foreign concept. The idea of because misogyny is sort of meant to be an irrational or illogical dislike of women, which means, so in our society, that's any discrimination against women, any suggestion that women aren't able to men is misogyny, aren't equal to men or as able as men is misogyny. Of course it is. But in those days, that was genuinely considered to be true. So it wouldn't, it was part of the fabric of society that men and women had different roles and different abilities. So it's hard to call him misogynist, but I will for the sake of this conversation, because he does just ignore women. He, as much as he can, he ignores what women have done. And he also throws women into two camps. So the best example is with Alice and Melisende, these two sisters, who but display many of the same characteristics. Actually, they're both quite power hungry and they're both quite ambitious. And William casts Melisende as this sort of like heroine, the good one, and then Alice is just this evil, scheming she-demon. And on top of that, he doesn't even attribute her own agency to her actions. So when he's criticizing her for rebelling against Jerusalem, he says things like, and wicked spirits entered her mind and made her do, I'm paraphrasing, but something like that. So he doesn't even give her credit for her own actions a lot of the time. But he really paints her in this very two-dimensional way as this villain. And we see this in a lot of the chronicles. So that women who try and seize power or break the mold of what society expects them are often derided. And a lot of the time it's pretty straightforward slut shaming. They say one of the queens of Jerusalem who leaves her husband, well, she's actually divorced and then leaves and decides not to come back. They say she goes to Constantinople and prostitutes herself to men of both high and low rank. Where are they getting this information from? I really don't think that's true, and yet they put it in the chronicles. So I did use other sources as well. There are many, as I mentioned before. Everyone was scribbling. So you have sources from men who were men at arms, like fighting men. You have sources from pilgrims who came to Jerusalem and wrote about what they saw. You have Muslim sort of travel writers, men who went on long journeys, who wrote about what they saw. So you've got sources from a variety of perspectives, and you have the archaeological record and many other things. But when you're dealing with the written sources, it really is about peeling back these layers of misogyny. And when they say, oh, this woman was a witch, or which it's not too much of that, but there's a little, when they say this woman was a witch, or this woman, was a terrible mother, or this woman prostituted herself to both men of both high and low rank, you then start thinking, right, well, this is clearly a takedown tactic. And then you begin to think about why that might be. And so it's about, scraping all of those value judgments away that have been applied to the women and just trying to get to the bones of what actually happened, and then trying to draw your own conclusions afresh from all of that. So it's going through with a fine-tooth comb to find the very few references to women. I mean, you've got my book there. It's not thick. It's not a chunky volume, and it's because thank you. But it's the reason for that is that we don't have anywhere near as much primary source material for what the women are doing as for what the men are doing, which is sad, because I would love to know more. But we have enough to piece their lives together and to give an overview of their lives and experiences. And that was the main exercise for me, was going through, finding these references and then piecing them together, but without the medieval value judgments that had been applied to, like, and this woman was, this woman was immoral because she did this, and this woman was a good woman because she did this, and so on and so forth. Take all of that away and start look at it afresh. Yeah.
And I mean, you do mention that at the very beginning, that, the terms of misogyny is not something that they had, and it's hard to sort of understand the way that they perceived their world, 800 years later. It's just a difficult way to understand their views. So you do make that very clear from the beginning, which is wonderful. And you've really worked to show us as much truth as possible. Was it a really difficult job to find enough about some of the lesser known women, especially with the fact that you've got Melisende written so well and spoken so highly of, and then Alice so lesser? Was it difficult to get through it and to find what you needed?
Yeah, so I mean, for Alice, to be honest, in her rebellions, we have very few sources apart from William of Tyre. I think there's one Islamic source which says, and at this point, the king of Jerusalem was engaged, there was internal strife or something like that. But so some of the events, we only have one source for them, which means you really do just have to take someone's word for what happened. But more often than not, I am happy to trust William of Tyre's version of events. I mean, occasionally he gets his chronology muddled, which inevitably happens because, as I say, he's a historian conducting interviews. So he'll talk to someone and they'll be like, well, this battle must have happened in this year because that's the year my dog died. They're using a lot of hearsay and putting the history together. That's not a direct quote, but that's the sort of thing I imagine being said to him.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So sometimes it's hard because you'd like to have. So, in terms of understanding Alice's rebellions, for example, we don't have a lot of sources saying what happened with Alice. We mainly have William of Tyre for explaining that. And I, as a historian, would like 2 or 3 more sources telling me what happened in those rebellions, so that I can, that I feel confident in that what I'm saying really is quite accurate. But sometimes you just don't have that, and sometimes. So when you're talking about the siege of Jerusalem, when Jerusalem falls to Saladin, one of the sources is quite clear that Sibylla is in Jerusalem, and it seems very apparent that Sibylla is playing a leading role in the defense of Jerusalem. She's the highest status figure in the city, and it would be conventionally normal for a woman in that position to be playing a role in the defense of the city. But then a lot of the other sources, they just don't mention Sibylla. They don't say that she's not there, but they don't say that she's there either. And so, I mean, some of them say she's somewhere else, but a lot of them they just ignore. It's not of interest to them. And so then you're sort of left wondering, okay, but does your silence mean that she was there and you just don't care because you don't actually care what women are doing? Or does it mean, or does it mean she wasn't there? And so that, there are question marks. They're all, the gaps in the sources leave question marks, but, we have to make educated guesses. And also, even when the sources are leaving out the women, you can sort of, you know that they are there. You know that they're always there in the background. So you can read the history that's written about the men. Doesn't specifically mention the women, but then you know from the other sources that the women were there too. So then you can make that part of their story as well. But it is complicated. But no, it was. I mean, it was a difficult job. I mean, yes and no. I think I would say it required patience, but it didn't, because it was so interesting. You know, it just sort of you just carried through with the momentum of it, because you, as you said, you know, even when you're reading my book, yeah, you might sometimes forget that you're reading non-fiction, which is great. But when I'm reading William of Tyre, I sometimes forget I'm reading non-fiction. You know, the medieval chronicles are every bit as exciting as the modern retellings of these events. Like they're very interesting documents. So no, yeah, it was long, but it was great. Yeah.
So you almost had to just interpret the women-shaped holes in the stories.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes they're very clearly defined women-shaped holes, so it's okay.
So we did sort of gloss over Eleanor of Aquitaine earlier. Do you want to just tell me a little bit about her role in the Crusades, since she didn't come from a city in Outremer?
100%. Sorry, before I jump into Anna, a gulp of tea is very necessary because it's a great story. Eleanor, so yeah, she's from the south of France. So she's not born in Outremer. She's not a Middle Eastern woman. She's not a Crusader queen in the conventional sense, but she is a Crusader queen because she goes on crusade. Eleanor is the first queen to go on crusade, and it's very exciting that she does this. So Eleanor's born in the south of France. And when she's a teenager, I think she's 15 years old, maybe even 14, she marries Louis of France, who is at this point the prince, the Dauphin. He's going to be the king of France. And then, you know, something like a month, maybe even less, after their wedding, his father dies, and Eleanor suddenly finds herself Queen of France and has to move up to Paris. And then she and her husband get involved in quite a lot of, you know, quite dodgy political scrapes, one of which ends up with Louis going to war with one of, you know, his lords, one of his neighbouring noblemen, and actually burning a village, and not just burning the village, but burning all the inhabitants of this village to death inside a church, which is called the Holocaust of Vézelay. And it's really, I mean, you do think of the medieval period as being more brutal, but actually this is beyond the pale even for them. And so this and some other things sort of start Louis on this penitential path, which will eventually mean that when Edessa falls, so we spoke about Edessa earlier in this interview, it's the territory that Melisende's mother was from, that's actually captured by the Atabeg Zengi in 1144, I think, something like that. I'm going to say the 1140s just to keep safe. Edessa falls, and then the Pope and so the Crusader States ask for help from the West. So Melisende and the others say we need some help. And the Pope backs them and issues a papal bull telling the kings of Europe, go help them. And Louis takes up this call, as does the German king. But Louis does something a bit different because he brings his wife. And there are lots of reasons why this might have been. It may be that he just didn't want to be apart from her. It may be that he was worried she'd be unfaithful to him if he left her behind. It's potentially a valid concern. Who knows? But also it's because Eleanor is like a lord of vassals in her own right. So Eleanor is the hereditary Duchess of Aquitaine, right? Which is the biggest and wealthiest region in France. And it has a lot of knights attached to it. So you guys, you know, the feudal thing, the knight calls the lords to go. And Eleanor is technically the one who has the loyalty of the lords and the knights of Aquitaine. So there's potentially a political reason for bringing her. But although that could have been transferred to Louis. So in any case, Eleanor goes on crusade. They have a very difficult journey. You know, it would have been a traumatizing experience for Eleanor, actually. I mean, so Constantinople, that would have all been fine. But once they start, you know, the journey through Europe to Constantinople, Istanbul would have been fine. But then the crossing Anatolia, the Anatolian plateau, it's awful. And the German army has gone ahead of them and been completely massacred. So on this journey, they're going to be passing the unburied bodies of their fellow knights who died. And then they also get into this huge battle on Mount Cadmus, which is this, you know, it's an obstacle they pass to get to the sea. It's a mountain, they have to go up it. And there's a complete tactical disaster. You know, arguably one of the lords leading the army is incredibly negligent and leaves the baggage section, which Eleanor would be travelling in, completely unprotected. And so it's subject to this very vicious and protracted attack. And the French army, they lose a lot of knights. And Eleanor clearly survives. But when Louis is writing home a list of the casualties, he's like, I can't list all the names for you now. I'll tell you later who died. So it's clearly, and that's just the noblemen. So you clearly lose a significant enough number of noblemen that the king can't even count and list them at this time. So it's a very difficult journey. And then they get to Antioch. And then here's where sort of out of the frying pan into the fire for Louis and Eleanor's relationship, because they're already, not getting on this journey, it seems. Maybe because Louis is not a very good leader, maybe because the journey is much harder than planned, all these things. And in Antioch, Eleanor's uncle is Prince Raymond of Antioch, married to Constance, who is a granddaughter of Morphia. And Raymond has come over from France to marry her, so he's Eleanor's uncle. And they have a lot in common. They both speak Poitevin. They're both from the south of France. They're from the same family. They end up spending a lot of time together, and then the rumours start to fly that actually they're having an affair. And I'm not going to get into debating that with you. I did a whole lecture, sort of like an hour long the other day, on whether or not they did. It's inconclusive. I think they probably didn't. From a gossip perspective, it's a shame, but I think they probably didn't have an affair. I think probably Raymond was counselling Eleanor to leave her husband, and they were maybe trying to scheme ways for her to do this. And also Raymond wanted soldiers from France to come and help him with his political, the conflict between Antioch and Aleppo. And Louis wanted the soldiers to go on to Jerusalem and attack Damascus or similar. So there was this big political conflict as well in terms of what the troops should do. Either way, Raymond and Louis have a massive falling out. Eleanor says, I want to stay with Raymond in Antioch. Louis says, like hell you will, and carries her away, so basically drags her away unceremoniously to Jerusalem. And then she's in disgrace. And we know that Eleanor is in disgrace because in Jerusalem, they have this big war council at which Melisende is one of the key attendees. William of Tyre, who's a very careful historian, gives a list of about probably 40 people who are at this council. I don't know if it's 40, but a lot of people. He names names. There's a list, okay? And Melisende is on that list. Eleanor is not on that list. If Eleanor had been at that war council, he would have told us. And she wasn't. So for whatever reason, Eleanor, despite having, the rank, being, a lord of vassals in her own right, as we've talked about, despite having sort of the rank to be at that council and probably the interest, she's ridden across continents to be there. She's excluded from the war council. So it does sort of suggest that she's in the doghouse, which also casts light on what's going on with her and her husband. Anyway, but no, that's her role in the crusade. And then the second crusade is an abject failure because at that war council, which Eleanor's excluded from, they make the very ill-advised decision to attack Damascus, and I could see why they would want Damascus. It would have been a huge prize if they had managed to take it. But they don't manage to take it, and they come home empty-handed. It's a major routing. And Eleanor and Louis' marriage Eleanor is sort of trying to ask for a divorce on the way home. They take separate ships home. They can't bear to be together. They go to the Pope potentially to ask for a divorce, and the Pope is like, no, you two have to stay together. And he literally makes them get into bed together in front of a load of people to symbolise their marriage being healed. But anyway, they divorce a couple of years later anyway. So yeah. Those are sort of Eleanor's experiences on Crusade. And what's also really interesting about it is the way the sources talk about Eleanor on Crusade. They attribute all this sort of mythological grandeur to her. They say, oh, she dressed as an Amazon warrior for the expedition. It's possible that she did. A few sources testify to women wearing breastplates, marching with the army. So it's possible. But then this in turn has given rise to all these sort of very sort of sexualized and orientalized portrayals of her. So I think the most famous portrayal of Eleanor of Aquitaine is Katherine Hepburn in A Lion in Winter, where she famously makes that statement, I rode bare-breasted halfway to Damascus. Well, that didn't happen. But, it's interesting to see how these myths and legends arise around her. She really has become a mythological figure. And I think that's in no small part due to her part in the Crusade, because as we've said, this was the idea of Crusades was such an exciting topic for medieval writers. They really jump on it and give it a lot of colour. So yeah,
absolutely. And I'm assuming she must have been changed from that experience, because then after she divorced her husband, she then ended up becoming Queen of England. Do you think that the experience of the Crusades changed her?
100%. I think how can an experience like that not change you? When you've gone from living in one country your whole life to then travelling across, something like 7, and really seeing battle and conflict firsthand. But also, as we've talked about, the women who are in the Middle East at this time are incredibly powerful. Even looking at their lives today, they're quite inspiring. I think to Eleanor, who's from a similar aristocratic and social background to these women, seeing Melisende sort of one of the key figures at this war council and sort of, ruling on equal footing with her son, and, also potentially meeting Constance and Antioch. This is an inspiring dynasty of women to stumble across when you're a medieval woman with a similar background. And I think it probably did inspire her to think she wants to have more agency over her life. And there are, it sort of showed her what women can do if they push for it. And obviously Eleanor does a lot trying to take power in her later life. We can't really get into it. But also, she gives birth to the most famous crusader of all time, which is Richard the Lionheart. And she was the parent who'd gone on crusade. Henry II, so Richard's father, talked a lot about going on crusade. He often said he was going to, but he never actually did it. He never made that journey. It was Eleanor who did. So there've been Eleanor telling stories about the East to Richard I and things. So I'm sure it had a big impact on her and what she wants to do. Yeah.
Do you have a favourite woman that you researched and wrote about in your book?
Oh, it's a tough question. I mean, and also, sort of when you write about anything to do with the Crusades, you always have to bear in mind that, okay, these women are really interesting, but you can't really like them because they are colonists. They are like a part of an oppressive regime taking land from native people. So, but just if we look at it externally from that, I should say Melisende. Melisende should always be my favorite because she's the most important and the most powerful. But really, for me, it's this minor character, Theodora, who sort of sneaks in one of the later chapters, because she's married to Melisende's eldest son, Baldwin III. She's a Byzantine princess who comes over for a political marriage. But then Baldwin dies, and she's left a widow at the age of something like 17, because she marries him when she's 12 or something, and she has no children. And she's given this very nice city acre but essentially to be locked away in and just live quietly forever. And it's unlikely she'll ever be allowed to remarry or have children or anything, because the king of Jerusalem would gain nothing from that. He'd actually lose control of the city if he let her remarry. So she has this quite grim future laid out for her. And then this completely bizarre event occurs, which is her sort of scandalous and philandering uncle arrives in the east, like fleeing scandal. He's like fleeing scandal in Byzantium. And in Antioch, he's seduced princesses across the empire. And he arrives in Acre, and Theodora just, it seems, falls for him hook, line and sinker, and vice versa. And they fall in love with each other. And then they arrange this elaborate fake kidnapping where, she pretends she's going somewhere else, and then they pretend that he's kidnapped her. But it's obviously consensual because, she's told him where she's going to be and things like this. And then they elope together, and they don't just elope together to like another Christian country. They elope to Nur ad-Din's court. They elope to Damascus, to Islamic territory. So you have, the former queen of Christian Jerusalem and a prince of Byzantium eloping to Islamic territory. And the fact that happened, it's like you say, you couldn't make it up. It's mind-blowing. But it's also, and it's a really creepy story because obviously he's her uncle and all these other factors. And there's a big age difference as well. But on top of that, he does Andronicus, this uncle, he seems really devoted to Theodora, and they stay together for the rest of her life and have children together. So it's a bizarre story, but it's also a love story. And I found that it was a very interesting sort of subplot to stumble on when I was studying Melisende and her descendants. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting and really exciting to write about.
Very interesting. And it's just one of many things that people can read about in your book. And if they want to purchase your book, Queens of Jerusalem, we'll leave a link down below to buy it. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, likewise.
This video was brought to you by World History Encyclopedia. For more great articles and interactive content, head to our website via the link below. World History Encyclopedia is a non-profit organisation, and you can find us on Patreon, a brilliant site where you can support our work and receive exclusive benefits in return. Your support helps us create videos twice a week, so make sure to check it out via the pop-up in the top corner of the screen or via the Patreon link down below. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you soon with another video.